Hello everybody and welcome back. We are continuing with unit number 3 today and we are on lesson 3. So we are going to shift gears a little bit. We've already talked about rocks and the rock cycle. So today we're going to talk about something a little bit more fun, which are barrier islands. So you may have been to the barrier islands of North Carolina before. These are our Outer Banks. So if you've ever taken a family trip or a beach trip to the Outer Banks, you have actually been to barrier islands. So as always, you should have downloaded your interactive notebook for the pages for the day. And this presentation goes along with those notes. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So what are barrier islands? These are just long bodies of sand that are separated from the mainland by a lagoon and from other islands by inlets at both ends. So basically these are just islands of sand that exist offshore from the mainland. So if this was North Carolina, this would be the shore of North Carolina, so the mainland shore. If you go to the beach, you could be off the mainland shore, but if you go to the barrier islands, the Outer Banks, you would actually be on the barrier islands. So here we have the mainland coast. Typically we've got marshes that exist around the coast, and then here are the barrier islands, which are just the islands of sand. Okay, this waterway that exists between the coast and the barrier islands is known as a lagoon. And then here where we have the separation of the barrier islands, they're called inlets. Okay, so we've got inlets, which are just waterways that separate the sand islands, which are the barrier islands. And then we have the lagoon that exists between the coastline and the barrier islands themselves. So 90% of North Carolina's shoreline is actually made of barrier islands, and there are 18 barrier islands in North Carolina. And if we look at this picture, we can actually see them if we trace along the shoreline. These are going to be our barrier islands, and these are just sand islands, again, that are separated from the main coast. So here we would have our main coast of the mainland, and then here are our sand barrier islands on the outer edge. Now here's that lagoon that exists in the middle. And this is a pretty zoomed out image, but if you look closely, you can see some of the inlets as well, where there's the separation between those islands. There are 5 components of a barrier island we need to know: the island, the inlets, tidal deltas, the shore face, and the beach. So the island itself is made up entirely of sand that's carried either from the ocean or from the lagoon beach by wind action and storm overwash. So wind is something that can carry and deposit sand, but also if there are ever storms or rougher than normal seas, those tides can pull sand and deposit them into the barrier islands. And a typical barrier island actually extends below sea level to a depth of about 30 feet. So it's important to understand that these barrier islands are pretty much composed mostly of sand and only sand. So this is not like the mainland coast that is like continental crust. This is an island that's made of sand, which can be a little bit detrimental when you start talking about building on barrier islands, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So again, the inlet is just channels that separate adjacent islands and allow the exchange of water between the ocean and the lagoon. So inlets can open, close, or migrate in just a matter of years. So barrier islands are subject to change, and they can change very quickly. So these inlets will migrate when sand pours into them from longshore currents, forcing them to move down drift. So basically, a longshore current is a current that moves parallel to the shore. So normally we think about currents moving in and out, but a longshore current will move parallel. So if you've ever gone to the ocean and you kind of get in at one point and you kind of are playing around in the ocean, and then you look up and you realize, oh, I've moved really far down the shore. That's similar to a longshore current because it's moving parallel and you're moving down the shoreline. Well, those currents can pick up sand and deposit them in these inlet ways, and it can cause them to close up. Similarly, it can remove sand from other places in the islands, and it will cause new inlets to open up as well. So again, that inlet that we see here in this picture is right here. It's just the opening of the water between the 2 barrier islands. A tidal delta is formed from sand that's deposited by the tidal currents. So again, those parallel longshore currents will bring sand from adjacent barrier islands, and adjacent means they're next to each other. So adjacent means side by side. and it'll bring that sand into the mouth of the inlet. And then the currents will move the sand into the sound or to the ocean side of the inlet to form the deltas. So the delta is that kind of like fan-like shape that we see right here. The shore face is also known as the lower beach, from the shoreline to a water depth of 30 to 60 feet. This contains the sand that may eventually form the beach and the dunes. So if we're looking at this image here, this is the barrier island itself, so made of sand. And this side is going to be the shore face, okay? So this is the side that faces the open ocean. And we have our shore face sediments that come in and will eventually form the dunes and the island itself. On this side, we have the lagoon side. And so this would be the side of the barrier islands that face the coast of the mainland. Okay, so this faces that water that's between the mainland coast and the barrier island. So the formation of barrier islands happened in 4 steps. So number 1, during the Ice Age, sea levels were low due to so much water frozen in glaciers. So if you guys have ever seen the movie Ice Age, there were a lot of glaciers, a lot of snow covered the earth. It was very cold. We had a cold climate that covered the earth. Well, a lot of the ocean water was all frozen up into glaciers. And because of that, the sea level was lower. So if you were to go to the modern day North Carolina shore back during the Ice Age, the shore would not be, or the ocean would not come up as high as it does now because the sea level would be lower. So over time, the ice melted and the sea levels would rise and river valleys become flooded. And then there was the formation of spit along headlands. And basically what that means is that there were just deposits of sand that accumulated around the coasts of the continents. And then eventually what you got was the separation of a barrier from the mainland. So over time, that sand would be pushed out and you would get what we know as modern day barrier islands with the lagoon in between the shore and the islands itself. So why are we learning about this today? Why are barrier islands so important? Well, number 1, they buffer the coastline from wave and storm energies of the open ocean. So anytime like hurricanes come up or there's a bad tropical storm, North Carolina's outer banks pretty much get the brunt of the force of the storm, but it will kind of buffer the mainland coast from those terrible like ocean surges and the energy from the storm. So they act as a buffer and they help protect the mainland. Also, they are highly productive, meaning that they serve as really good and nourishing habitats for lots of different organisms. So they're important habitats and they're important in the life cycle of many open ocean species as well. So they're important habitats and they help protect us from storms. So nature can affect barrier islands, and these are kind of the different things in nature that can affect them. So waves, they will continually deposit and remove sediments from the ocean side of the island, so the side that faces the open ocean. Currents, longshore currents that are caused by waves hitting the island at an angle can move the sand from one end of the island to another. So it's important to know that barrier islands are always changing. They do not stay still, and they can change actually very quickly. Tides, so we learned about tides in astronomy and how they're controlled by the moon, the gravity of the moon and the sun. They can move sediments into the salt marshes and eventually fill them in. And thus the sound sides of barrier islands tend to build up as the ocean sides erode, meaning that the side that faces the lagoon can become larger while we have erosion on the front side of the ocean-facing side of the barrier islands. Winds will blow sediments from the beach to help form dunes and into the marshes, which contribute to their buildup. Dunes are actually very important because dunes also act as a buffer against storms and wind damage. So dunes are a good thing. You definitely want to have dunes on your beach. Sea level changes. So rising sea levels tend to push barrier islands toward the mainland. And just as a reminder, barrier islands do move. They are constantly moving and being reshaped by nature. Also, some of this is caused by human interaction. So as we contribute to global warming, we will get rising sea levels and we will kind of directly drive the movement of these barrier islands. And also storms. So Hurricanes and other storms have the most dramatic effect on barrier islands by creating overwash areas. So basically just areas where higher tides will pull more sediments and sand up onto the shore. And it will also erode beaches as well as other portions of barrier islands. So those storms will kind of cut into the shoreline and pull some of that sand, that necessary sand, away. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. And if we think about building on barrier islands, you're going to read about it a little bit in your activity for the day, but we know that barrier islands move and change their shape significantly. So when we think about building on barrier islands, sometimes it can be very detrimental because the sand will shift and change so much that a lot of times there can be a lot of property damage on the island. So just think twice if you ever want a beach house. Think before you build on a barrier island. So that's all I have for today. If you guys have any questions, shoot me an email, and if not, I will see you in the next one.